el año 1936, Alonso Chan nació a sus padres Cristina y Rafael Chan en Mérida, Yucatán, México. Alonso fue el tercer hijo en la familia y tuvo otros 5 hermanos: Rafael, Alberto, Manuel, Beatriz y Cristina. Alonso y su familia fueron vendedores de frutas en la ciudad y capital más poblada del estado de Yucatán. Cuando Alonso tenía unos 2 o 3 años, su familia se convirtió en adventistas del séptimo día a través de la influencia de un evangelista y de su tía Marta. En el año 1960 y a la edad de 13 años, Alonso y Manuel salieron de Mérida para asistir a una escuela adventista del séptimo día en Navojoa, Sonora, donde su hermano Alberto era el tesorero de la escuela. Ahí fue que Alonso estudió secundaria y se graduó 3 años después. En 1963, Alonso comenzó sus estudios en la Universidad de Montemorelos en Nuevo León para obtener una licenciatura en ministerio. Su madre Cristina era una persona muy decisiva y no temía hacer grandes cambios. Vendió todo lo que poseía en Mérida y trasladó a la familia a Montemorelos en 1964 para que sus hijos pudieran asistir a una escuela adventista del séptimo día. Durante los años que seguían, ella fue bendecida por vivir con sus hijos Rafael, Alonso, Manuel, Cristina y Beatriz, todos juntos mientras estudiaban en Montemorelos. Alonso se graduó con un bachillerato en ministerio en 1967 y su corazón se puso a servir a otros y a compartir el amor de Dios. El próximo año, en 1968, Alonso fue el primero de su familia a emigrar a los Estados Unidos. Vino solo al condado de Orange County, California, a trabajar para la compañía Singer. A menudo enviaba dinero a casa para mantener a su madre y para que Rafael, Beatriz y Cristina pudieran terminar la escuela. En los Estados Unidos, Alonso se comprometió con el ministerio desde el principio y fue uno de los fundadores originales de la Iglesia Adventista del Séptimo Día de Anaheim, una prominente iglesia en el condado de Orange County. Fue ahí donde conoció el amor de su vida, la hermosa Delia Uriarte. Alonso y Delia se casaron en 1972 en la Iglesia Adventista de Garden Grove. Su amor y devoción entre ellos era innegable. Sus vidas se enriquecieron hasta más con el nacimiento de su hija Daisy en 1974, y luego su hijo Alonso Jr. nació en 1976. Alonso siempre fue un trabajador diligente, sin miedo de aprender varias nuevas profesiones. Estudió y llegó a ser un técnico de rayos X, un agente de real estate, e incluso trabajó como colportor con su hermano Manuel durante 6 años. Pero Alonso será recordado más por sus muchos años de servicio como pastor, una persona amable y gentil, guiando a otros y animando a los corpulentos, y compartiendo el amor de la vida buena siguiendo a Cristo Jesús. Siempre con un corazón de sirviente, el pastor Alonso Chan fue el pionero y fundador de la Iglesia Adventista de La Habra. Él inició y sirvió como pastor en La Habra de 1979 hasta el año 1992. La Habra sigue siendo una próspera iglesia hasta el día de hoy. El pastor Alonso también fue pionero y fundador de la iglesia hispana en Moreno Valley y sirvió como pastor ahí durante 28 años, desde el año 1992 hasta el año 2020. Sobre todo, el pastor Alonso Chan era un padre amoroso y un esposo fiel. Alonso y Delia permanecieron unidos durante 49 años de matrimonio y disfrutaron de innumerables alegrías. Esto no es más que una breve pausa en su historia, pues pasarán la eternidad juntos en el cielo, junto con su familia y su gran Salvador. En la víspera de la Navidad del año 2020, después de una valiente batalla con COVID-19, el pastor Alonso Chan se fue pacíficamente a descansar, a los 84 años mientras recibía tratamiento en el Centro Médico del Sistema de Salud de la Universidad de Riverside en Moreno Valley. El pastor Chan es sobrevivido por su querida esposa Delia, su hija Daisy, su hijo Alonso, sus hermanos Rafael y Manuel, sus hermanas Cristina y Beatriz, y una familia grande y agradecida en conocerlo. Estamos consolados de saber que las innumerables vidas que tocó el pastor Chan a través de su ministerio continuarán con su legado de amor y servicio en este mundo hasta el día que lo veamos de nuevo en la gran resurrección. Nuestra querida tía Delia, a Daisy y a Kirk, Alonso y René, por parte de toda la familia Chan les extendemos nuestras más sinceras condolencias por el fallecimiento del pastor Alonso Benjamín Chan, su esposo, su padre, nuestro hermano, nuestro tío. Mi nombre es el pastor Daniel Chan y soy el hijo del pastor Manuel Chan que vive en Roseville, California. El pastor Manuel Chan es el hermano menor del pastor Alonso Benjamín Chan. Así que por parte de mi papá Manuel, de mi mamá Consuelo, de mis 4 hermanas Nilda, Cristina, Ana y Alicia, les extendemos nuestras más sinceras condolencias. En un día como este estamos tristes, pero profundamente agradecidos por el haber conocido una persona como nuestro tío. Para nosotros, nuestro tío Alonso fue el más conocido y el más apreciado. Así que nuestros corazones están quebrantados junto con ustedes. En primer lugar, también quisiéramos afirmar que fueron mi tío Alonso y mi tía Delia que nos ayudaron cuando nosotros venimos a este país en los 1970. Fueron mis tíos que nos ayudaron a establecernos en este nuevo país. Su sacrificio por nosotros, tía, nunca ha sido olvidado y nunca lo será. Nosotros sabemos que cualquier éxito que hemos tenido en este país fue en gran parte del sacrificio que usted y mi tío hizo por nosotros. Daisy and Alonso, as you know through your mom and your dad, we experienced many, many amazing memories. And we experienced a lot of amazing firsts. It was only through the generosity and the vision of your parents that we got to experience many firsts, like the first Christmas. You know, my parents never celebrated Christmas. Our first Christmas presents were from your parents. Our first trips to Disneyland were because of your parents. Our first camping trips, our first trips to the beach. We remember piling into your dad's van and going to Huntington Beach. And your dad was so gentle, so kind, so generous with us. He would take us everywhere without complaining. And we will always, always treasure those precious, precious moments with you and with your father and with your mother. Many, many different memories that we can think of about your dad. But we were most blessed by our tío Alonso's kind and generous, loving heart. He was a picture of gentleness and humanity that is so needed in today's day and age. He will always be remembered as being a peacemaker, not just in his churches, but he was a peacemaker in his families, always attending to even the most difficult, and he was always willing to seek after them. We will always remember his generosity. But the thing that we'll remember most is the legacy that he leaves behind as a minister of the gospel in seeking to seek after and to be there for other people. No question about it, my uncle Alonso was called to serve, and he lived to love other people. And he did it passionately, and because he did, he was led to shape so many other lives, including our own. You know, it's entirely possible that because of his dedication to love and to serve others, that it put his life in harm's way. But I'm reminded by the words of Christ in John chapter 15 that says, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." Your dad was called to love, and he lived to serve. And he did this until his dying day. And I believe that if given the chance to do it all over again, he would have done it just the same. And my prayer is that God grant you the peace and the serenity to accept the way that your dad chose to live his life in service of others. For me, my family, and for all who knew him, he will always be remembered for his generosity, for his patience, for his kindness, for his integrity, but most of all for being willing to love and to serve others, no matter what the cost. As I think about my uncle Alonso, I think about his eternal legacy that he leaves behind. And speaking of legacy, I want to tell you that one of my favorite places to visit in the world is to visit our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. I love learning about our country's history, and most of all about the most influential people that left an indelible mark on this country. In Washington, D.C., there are over 160 memorials and monuments commemorating the legacy of all those who came before us to shape this country that in turn has shaped so many lives in so many countries outside of the U.S. But off the beaten path, in the sea of all these memorials that exist in Washington, D.C., there's a memorial to a person by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. You know, as I visited that memorial recently, I thought, in a sea of memorials to poised presidents and to persuasive politicians and to powerful military generals, there stands a memorial to a man who was none of those things. In a city of founding fathers and politicians, why such a large memorial to a pastor? It is because in the story of America, the story of democracy and the story of the fight for justice and equality could not be told without telling of the story of the great pastor Martin Luther King Jr. This pastor, like your father, was called to love, and he lived to serve. The story of America is not complete without the story of the great Martin Luther King Jr. I'm here to tell you that the story of Danny Chan could not be told without the story and the great influence of Pastor Alonso Benjamin Chan, who was so influential in my life and in the lives of so many others. The story of so many of these people whose lives he touched could not be told without telling of the story of the great Pastor Alonso Benjamin Chan. There are thousands who were influenced by the words, by the ministry, and by the life of Pastor Chan throughout his 52 years of amazing ministry. You will never know all their names, and you will never hear all of their stories, but their lives were touched in meaningful ways that continue to be felt until this day. All of us are grateful for having known and to have been influenced by this amazing and remarkable life. I'd like to end by telling you one story. It's not just a story, but it's a series of events that happened in the life of my father's ministry. It's a story about one of my dad's first churches. He came to a church way down in the deep south of Mexico, and he began to pastor in that church. And every Sabbath he would come and he would he would enter into the church, get ready for worship, and he noticed that there was a beautiful bouquet of flowers that was sitting right there at the steps right below the podium. And he kept thinking to himself, wow, those are really beautiful flowers. But this is a small church. They don't have a lot of money. Why are they spending so much on this beautiful bouquet of flowers? Because week after week, there was always a brand new bouquet of fresh flowers. So he asked the church treasurer and he said, why are we spending so much money? You know my dad, he doesn't like to spend money. He asked him, why are we spending so much money on this bouquet of flowers? And the treasurer told him, Pastor, we don't spend that much money. In fact, every single week, that bouquet of flowers just magically appears. We don't know who's bringing it. So my father said, okay, I need to figure this out. So one day or the next Sabbath, he shows up to church super early, And he goes into his office, and there's a little curtain, and he hides behind that curtain. And he waits to see what happens. See, what would happen is very early on a Saturday morning, one of the deacons would open up the church. He would open it wide, and then he would go home and eat his breakfast. And by the time he got back, or anybody got back, the bouquet of flowers was there. So my father said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. So he's waiting there very early on Sabbath. The deacon has opened the church, he's gone home, and he's waiting, and he's waiting. Finally, this car drives up. Beautiful, beautiful late model car. And this well-dressed man gets out. And he walks up the steps into the church and down the aisle. And he's carrying a beautiful bouquet of flowers. And he places that bouquet at the foot of the steps. And as soon as he turns, he says a quick prayer, he's about to leave. My father jumps out and he says to him, excuse me. He's like, who are you? And thank you so much for bringing this bouquet of flowers. The man looks up and he says, oh, hi, I just came and dropped this off. I needed to go on my way. My father, he's very persuasive, and he began to talk to him, and they sat down and they started talking. And as it turns out, he had been doing this for quite some time. And my father was able to get from him that years ago, he grew up in that church. As a boy, he sat in these pews and he played in the playground and outside the church. And he grew up in that church, but eventually he didn't have much to do with the church. And at that time, his mother became very sick. And she was terminal. And he went to visit her. And the last conversation he had with his mom looked up and he said, son, will you do me one favor? Just promise me one thing. My dying wish is that every Saturday morning that you bring a bouquet of flowers and put it there in the steps right next to where the podium is in the church. Promise me that. And so this man, his name was Guillermo, he said, I will promise to do that for you, Mom. His mom unfortunately passed away, but true to his word, he kept his promise. And every single Saturday morning, he would bring a bouquet of flowers to his mother's church until the day that my father met him. In that moment, my father realized that his mother, even though she was no longer with him, made him promise to do something that would connect him with God in a meaningful way. You see, when a mother comes to her last few days, and her dying wish will always be what a parent's wish will be, is that our children will be so close to God that they will be able to be reunited once again at the resurrection. Tia Delia, Daisy, and Alonso. When I think about my Uncle Alonso, I don't know what was on his mind the last few days and the last few moments of his life. But I know what was in his heart, and it was you. And the greatest desire in his heart was that you continue to seek after God and to stay close to him in meaningful ways so that one day he could be reunited with you. His greatest desire as a husband and as a father was to see you on Resurrection Day. I'm encouraged by the words of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16, that says, for the Lord himself will come down from heaven, and with a loud command, and the voice of the archangel, and the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ, they'll rise first. I believe we will see my uncle once again. And my prayer for you is that you be filled with peace of knowing that he lived a good life, that he touched so many lives, and that his greatest desire is to reunite with all of us on the great resurrection morning. God bless you. You have our love. We're always with you. And I can't wait till we're reunited with him on resurrection morning.